The night Lorraine was buried, I stood at the back edge of our property where the mown grass ends and the Douglas fir starts. And Cora was at my feet, perfectly still, her chin just barely lifted toward the tree line. She was not growling. She was not trembling the way she did when a deer pushed through the salal in the dark. She was calm the way she gets when she recognizes something, and I had learned, across 14 years with that dog, to trust the difference. I looked where she was looking, and there in the gap between two firs, where the last of the evening light was gone and I was reading the dark more than seeing into it, I understood something Ruth Aldrich had told me 50 years before, in a farmhouse kitchen with her hands flat on the oilcloth and her voice lower than I had ever heard a person speak. I finally understood what she had been asking me to protect, and why, and what it had cost her to carry it alone before she put it in my hands. I am going to tell you this now because I am 73 years old, and my heart is failing in a way the doctors at the hospital in Enumclaw describe with a lot of careful language that amounts to the same thing. Lorraine has been gone 8 months. She was the only person alive who shared the weight of what I know, and she never once asked me to speak it aloud, and now I am the last one who holds it. I have decided, finally, that it does not belong in the ground with me. My name is Clayton Holloway. I spent 31 years falling timber in the Cascades, starting in old-growth operations out of a small camp north of Packwood in 1963, and finishing with a cutting crew in second-growth country near the White River drainage in 1994. I know what a footprint in soft ground looks like, and I know the difference between one left by a man in logging boots and one left by something else. I know the sound a stand of timber makes when something large is moving through it versus the sound it makes when nothing is. I know how to read a ridge. I know how to read a clear cut, a skid road, a windfall, a frozen creek, and a stretch of salal, pressed flat in a pattern that means something moved through it with weight and intention. I am not a man who invented the world I needed to see. I am constitutionally incapable of that. I am the kind of man who talked himself out of what I know at every possible turn for the better part of 30 years, and only stopped when the accumulated evidence made talking myself out of it something I could no longer do without lying to myself. I want to be clear about that distinction before I say another word. Lorraine and I married in May of 1971. We had met the previous autumn at a church social in Randall, where I had come in from camp for a long weekend and she had driven up from the valley with her mother Ruth. I was 22. Lorraine was 23. She had her mother's colouring, dark hair, and a particular kind of stillness in the face that I thought at the time was shyness, but came to understand was something more considered, more patient. We married at the county courthouse with 2 witnesses, a Tuesday morning, and drove back to the rented house I had near the camp. Lorraine was not a woman who required ceremony. She said once that a thing was either true or it was not, and the paperwork was for other people's comfort, not hers. That was the most she ever said on the subject in 52 years. Ruth came to us the following spring. This was April of 1972, and I had been Lorraine's husband for nearly a year, and I thought I understood the shape of the family I had married into, which was quiet and self-sufficient, and lightly populated. Lorraine's father was not a subject that came up. Ruth had never offered an explanation, and Lorraine had never asked for one in my presence. I had the good sense back then to leave space in a conversation that 2 women had clearly decided to leave unfilled. Ruth drove in on a Thursday. She was 51 years old, a compact woman with strong hands from decades of midwife work in the foothill communities east of the Nisqually drainage. She had delivered babies in farmhouses and logging camps, and once, she told me, in the bed of a truck pulled off a logging spur because there had not been time to get further. She was respected in the specific way that people who do hard, useful work in isolated country are respected, without much being said about it. She sat down at our kitchen table, put both hands flat on the oilcloth, looked at me for a long moment and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand it is not a small thing I am asking." Lorraine was standing at the counter. She did not turn around. I remember that clearly. She stood with her back to us, and I understood, from that posture, that she already knew what was coming, or the shape of it, and that she had decided the telling was Ruth's to do. Ruth asked me to promise that I would never speak of Lorraine's origin to anyone outside that kitchen. Not to family, not to a doctor, not to a minister, not in drink, not in anger, and not on whatever form they were using for death certificates in whatever county I happened to die in. She asked me to promise that I would keep Lorraine's life entirely ordinary in the telling of it to the world, and to carry the other version in silence until I went into the ground. I told her I would need to understand what I was promising first. She nodded, like she expected that. Lorraine still had not turned around. Ruth told me the following in a voice so even and so flat it had the quality of a surveyor reading coordinates. She said that in the late summer of 1946, she had been living alone on the family homestead in the Cascade foothills, 19 miles from the nearest town, the road in unpaved and unreliable after mid-September. Her husband had died the previous winter of a burst appendix, and she had decided to stay through the year because leaving meant losing the homestead, and she was not ready to lose it. She said that through that summer she became aware of something moving in the timber above the property, something large and patient that never came close enough for her to see clearly, but that she tracked by its sounds and by what it left at the edge of the clearing. She said it watched her work. She said it was not frightening in the way she would have expected a large, unknown thing to be frightening. She said it had a quality of attention she could only describe as considered. I am not going to tell you what she described happened between them. I gave my word on that, and my word is the only currency I have left. I will tell you that by the following spring, Lorraine was born. I will tell you that Ruth delivered her herself, alone in the homestead, on the 4th of March, 1947. I will tell you that the birth was uncomplicated, and that Lorraine came into the world healthy and perfect, and that Ruth looked at her daughter and understood, in the particular way that a woman who has been a midwife for 20 years understands biological facts, what the child was and what the child was not. She carried that knowledge alone for 25 years before she placed it in my hands. I sat with that for a while after Ruth finished speaking. I did not say anything immediately. I got up and put the kettle on because my hands needed something to do. I stood at the stove with my back to the table the way Lorraine had been standing a few minutes before, and I thought about the woman I had married, the exact particular specific woman I had spent a year building a life with, and I could not find a single thing that the information Ruth had just given me changed about her. I turned around and I said, "All right." Ruth looked at me steadily for a moment, then nodded once, and that was the end of the formal conversation. We had tea. She stayed 2 nights and drove back down the valley on Saturday morning. I never heard her speak of it again. Now here is where I have to slow down, because the easy thing to do would be to jump from Ruth's kitchen table disclosure straight to the night of the funeral. And I cannot do that honestly. What happened between 1972 and 2022 is the actual account, and it is not a clean story with a beginning and an end. It is 50 years of accumulation, and I owe it the time it takes to lay out properly. Lorraine was entirely ordinary in her life. I want to say that plainly. She taught 2nd grade in the Eatonville School District, for 18 years. She grew a kitchen garden every summer and put up tomatoes and green beans in glass jars every fall and stacked them in the basement in rows so precise you could have run a level along them. She read every evening, paperbacks from the library, and she was a sound sleeper and a steady wife and a woman who, in 52 years of marriage, I never once heard raise her voice in anger. She had no particular gift I could point to and say, "There, that is the thing that sets her apart." She was not unusually strong or unusually tall. She was 5 feet and 6 inches, the same as her mother. Her hands were similar to Ruth's, strong for their size, but that was consistent with a woman who gardened and canned and worked with her hands all her adult life. What I accumulated across those years was not dramatic. It came in small pieces, separated by years sometimes, and each piece looked ordinary from one angle and looked like something else from another. This is the part that took me so long to trust, and the part I am most careful about now in the telling, because I know how it sounds. The first thing I noticed was in 1976. Lorraine and I had taken a long weekend to drive up into the high country east of the park boundary. We had camped 2 nights on a Forest Service road, no hookups, just the truck and a tent, and Lorraine's cast iron pan on the camp stove. The second night, sometime well after dark, I woke to the sound of Lorraine moving around outside the tent. I came out, and she was standing at the tree line, very still, her back to me. I called her name. She turned, and her face in the flashlight beam had that particular, composed expression she wore when she was waiting for something to resolve on its own. The way she looked when one of her second graders was working through a problem, she knew they could reach on their own if she gave them the time. She said she had heard something and had wanted to take a look. I asked what she had seen. She said nothing, which was probably true, and we went back to bed. I told myself she had heard a raccoon or a black-tailed deer because that was the most sensible explanation available, and I left it there. I think about how many times I did that across the following years. The most sensible explanation available, I held on to that phrase like it was a piece of rigging. In 1983, I was running a crew in the upper end of a drainage west of the mountain, and we had a section of second-growth Douglas fir on a bench that had been logged once before in the late 40s and grown back thick and straight. We had been on it 3 days when one of the fallers on my crew, a man named Gus Prentice, who had been in the woods longer than I had and was not given to storytelling, came off the slope during the lunch break and said to me, quietly and without any particular drama, that there was something up in the timber above the cut that was not a bear, and was not a cougar, and was not anything he had a name for, and that it had been standing in the same place for 2 mornings running. I went up with him after lunch, and we looked for sign. We found 2 places where the salal had been pressed flat, not torn, pressed, by something that had stood still for a long time. The prints in a soft patch of soil at the edge of the second area were longer than my boot by 4 inches, and my boot was a size 11. The stride was longer than anything I could replicate without breaking into a run. I told Gus it was probably a bear moving through, that bears could leave a confused print in soft ground when they were foraging slowly. Gus looked at me the way a man looks at another man who has just said something both of them know is not right. But he let it go, because Gus was from the same school of thought I was, which is that you say what you can back up and you leave the rest alone. We moved the crew to a different section the following morning and finished the unit without incident. I drove home that Friday and did not tell Lorraine what I had found, and I did not let myself think too carefully about the fact that I had not told her, because the reason I had not told her was not entirely clear to me yet. The rational explanation failed me a second time in 1991. Lorraine and I had driven up to visit the old homestead in the foothills, the Aldrich property, which by then had been empty for 4 years since Ruth died. We went up once a year or so to check on the structure, clear the gutters, make sure the roof was holding. It was September, a dry year, and the track-in from the county road was passable. We walked the property the way we always did, and at the back of the clearing where the timber came in close, I found a row of stones. Not a natural arrangement, not the kind of thing the ground does on its own. Someone had placed 7 flat stones in a straight line along the edge of the grass, evenly spaced, the way you would mark a boundary or a grave, or a place that mattered. They had not been there on our last visit. I looked at Lorraine. She was looking at the stones with that same composed, waiting expression. She said, "Animals don't do that." And she said it the way you say something that you have known for a long time and are finally saying out loud because the evidence finally required it. She did not say anything else. I measured the space between stones later, walking heel to toe. Each gap was roughly 2 feet. 7 stones, 6 gaps. I told myself someone had been on the property, a hiker, a trespasser, someone who had walked the old track by accident. I told myself that until I was back in the truck on the county road, and then I stopped telling myself, because a hiker does not place stones at the edge of a dead woman's clearing in a pattern that precise, and I had been in the woods long enough to know what deliberate looked like. The third failed explanation came in 1998. This is the one that broke the last of my rational framework, and I want to be careful about how I describe it, because the temptation is to make it larger than it was. It was not large. It was very small, and that is why it finished the job. Lorraine had been ill that spring, nothing serious in the end, a respiratory infection that put her in bed for 2 weeks in March. I was retired by then, and I was home with her through it. On the 12th night of it, I woke in the early hours, and Lorraine was not beside me. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table in her robe, with the back door open to the cold air, and on the step outside the door, placed just inside the threshold, there was a bundle of cedar boughs. Fresh cedar, recently cut, 3 branches wound loosely together. Lorraine had her hands around a cup of tea, and she was looking at the boughs on the step. I stood there for a long time. I did not say anything because I did not know what the right words were. Lorraine finally said, without turning, "You can close the door now. He knows I am all right." She said it the way she would say the kettle was done. Completely even, completely certain. I closed the door. I sat down across from her. I looked at my wife of 27 years across the kitchen table in the middle of the night, and I understood, in that moment, that she had always known, that she had known her entire life and had kept it in the same private room. She kept everything that was hers alone. I had kept Ruth's secret for 26 years at that point. I realized sitting there that Lorraine had kept her own version of it for 51. I asked her how long. She said, "I think always, Clayton. Not in words, just always." We sat there until the kitchen lightened. I never raised it again because she never asked me to, and because whatever she carried in that room of hers was hers to carry on her own terms, and I had understood that about her from the first year of our marriage. The cedar boughs were gone from the step when I opened the door in the morning. I did not look for tracks. After that, I stopped trying to find the sensible explanation. Not because I stopped caring whether I was right, but because I had run out of scaffolding to hold a contrary argument up, and I have never been a man who argues past the point where the argument can stand on its own. I kept the promise Ruth had extracted from me. I kept it through 31 years in the timber, through the years Lorraine taught school, through the conversations with neighbors and friends and family, where I said Lorraine's father had passed before she was old enough to know him, which was true in one way and not true in another. I kept it through Ruth's death in 1987, when I stood at the grave in the cemetery east of Eatonville, and understood for the first time what it felt like to be the only person alive who held a particular truth. I kept it through 35 years after that, and I will tell you that the weight of it is not sharp. It is not the kind of thing that cuts you. It is more like the weight of a full pack that you have been carrying so long, you have forgotten it is there until you set it down. Lorraine died on a Thursday in February 2022, 74 years old, a heart that had simply decided its time was done, which is a thing I have some personal understanding of now. She died at home in the bed we had shared for 52 years, with my hand in hers, and the last thing she said, clearly, was my name. I have held on to that. I intend to. We buried her in the same cemetery where Ruth was laid, east of Eatonville. The service was a Tuesday in February, cold and dry, the kind of February day in the foothills that looks like iron and smells like frozen soil and cedar pitch. 12 people came, which was right for Lorraine. She had never wanted a crowd. Her former students, a couple of the women she had been in a reading group with for 20 years, the neighbors from down the road. I stood through it without feeling much of anything, which I have been told is common, and which I believe is the mind's way of spacing the grief out over a longer period so you do not drown in it all at once. We drove back to the property in the early afternoon. The people who had come dispersed by 3 o'clock. By 4:30, I was alone in the house with Cora, who had been fed and had gone to the back door and looked at me until I let her out. I walked out behind her into the cold and the last of the grey light, and we went to the back of the property, to the place where the mown grass ends and the fir starts. This is the same place I described at the beginning. I want you to understand that I am not a man who staged this or went looking for it. I went to the back of the yard because Cora went to the back of the yard, and Cora went because she knew something I did not yet know. She stopped at the edge of the grass. Her chin lifted. She was looking into the timber at the gap between 2 firs where the light was already gone. She was completely calm. I stood there and I looked where she was looking, and after a while I could make out the shape. I am not going to describe it in more detail than I can swear to in good conscience. It was large, larger than a man, standing still in a way that something that size has no ordinary business standing still. It was set back into the timber far enough that I was reading its outline more than its features, the way you read a ridge at dusk, the mass of it against the darker mass of the trees. It did not move. It was not threatening in its posture, not in any way that my body read as threat. And in 31 years of working in country where cougars and bears were a genuine occupational consideration, I learned to trust what my body registered. Cora's tail moved once, slowly, the way it did when she knew someone. I do not know how long we stood there, the 3 of us, with the cold coming up from the ground and the timber around us entirely still. Long enough that the last of the light went. Long enough that I stopped trying to see it clearly and simply stood in the fact of it. And then I understood what Ruth had meant when she had sat at my kitchen table in April of 1972 and put her hands flat on the oilcloth and asked me to carry this in silence. I understood that she was not asking me to protect a secret, because the secret was shameful. She was asking me to protect a relationship that existed outside every category the world had built to contain such things, and that the world's categories, however well-intentioned, would have crushed it the moment they were applied. She was asking me to hold a space open. 50 years of held silence as an act of care, not concealment. The creature standing in the timber on the evening of Lorraine's burial had come to stand there because Lorraine was gone. I believe that with the same settled certainty I believe in the grade of a slope or the sound of a widowmaker in a wind. I cannot give you the mechanics of how it knew or when it travelled or from how far. I can only tell you what I observed. And what I observed was a presence that had been patient with my wife across her entire lifetime, that had placed cedar boughs on a sick woman's doorstep in the middle of a March night, that had arranged 7 stones in a dead woman's clearing the way you mark a thing that matters, that had stood in the timber above a logging cut watching over a piece of country that held something it recognized. And that presence had come on the day she was put in the ground to stand at the edge of what had been her home and acknowledge that she was gone. That is the act of grief. I recognized it because I was full of the same thing. We stood there together in that, the 3 of us, until Cora shifted at my feet and the shape in the timber moved, once, and was absorbed into the dark, the way a shape dissolves when you stop trying to fix it and let your eyes go easy. There was no sound I could name. The timber did not crack or thresh. It was simply present, and then it was not, the way things go when they know how to move in their own country. I stood at the edge of the grass for a while longer. Cora sat against my boot. The cold was coming on steady, and I could see my breath. And after a while the stars were out, and I stood there carrying 50 years of kept silence and feeling it redistributed somehow across a larger number of shoulders than I had believed were available. I went inside and I put the kettle on, because that is what my hands knew to do. I have told this account twice in my life. Once to Lorraine herself the morning after we sat in the kitchen with the cedar boughs on the step, when I said out loud what I understood about her and about Ruth and about the country above the homestead. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she reached across the table and put her hand on mine and said, "Good." Just that word, good. As if I had finally passed a test she had been too kind to name, and once to you now, because I am 73 years old and my heart is running down, and Lorraine is in the ground and Ruth is in the ground, and I am the last person alive who holds this. And I have decided that it should not end with me. Not because I expect anyone to believe it, not because I need vindication at this late stage, with 1 foot already in the direction of the cemetery east of Eatonville. I decided to say it because Ruth spent 25 years carrying it alone before she trusted me with it. And I spent 50 years carrying it alongside Lorraine. And the weight of a thing like that is not meant to disappear into silence. It is meant to pass to someone who can hold it with the same care it was given to me. Lorraine never asked me to lie for her. Not once in 52 years. She asked me, through the whole long shape of her life, simply to leave certain rooms of hers unfurnished for the world's inspection. And I was glad to do it, because she extended me the same courtesy, and I knew by then that the rooms we leave closed are not empty rooms. They are the ones we live in most, honestly. I am not asking you to decide what any of this means in the categorical sense. I spent 50 years not deciding that, and I am a more careful man for having kept the question open. What I am asking is simpler. I am asking you to hold it. The way Ruth asked me to hold it in a farmhouse kitchen in 1972, with her hands flat on the oilcloth and her voice low and even. The way I held it while I felled timber and raised a garden and slept next to my wife, and drove to the cemetery east of Eatonville on a cold iron Tuesday, and stood at a grave while 12 people stood with me. You are the keeper now, and I am glad it is you, and I am glad it is done. Cora is at my feet as I say this. She is asleep with her chin on my boot, her one torn ear turned out the way it always is, her side rising and falling steady. Good dog. She knew before I did. She has always known before I did. The country above that old homestead is still up there, 19 miles from the nearest road in, on a track that washes out most springs. The fir has grown back over what was cleared. The stones Ruth Aldrich set the foundations on are still in the ground. Whatever watches from the timber above that clearing is still watching, I believe, and it has been watching long enough that a human life is a brief thing to it, the way a season is brief to a stand of old growth. And I find I am at peace with being brief. I don't know what it was. I have stopped needing the word for it. What I know is what it did, across the slow length of a woman's life, and across one cold evening in February when the ground was frozen and the stars were coming out, and the last of the grey light was going out of the sky. And something stood in the timber and grieved with me because we had both, in our different and unmeasurable ways, loved the same person. That is enough. That has always been enough. If you have been sitting with something like this, something you have carried a long time in a room you keep closed, the next story is on the screen.